here, and there we are.
Should be working now.
All right, perfect. So welcome everybody to the Older Vermonters Caucus. Appreciate you coming today. Just wanted to give an update that next week we have our congressional delegation. I put that out in the email for this, and I'll follow up again. So next week we'll have our congressional delegation here to give us an update on what's going on in DC. So before I get started, is there anybody who has any announcements that they wanted to make? If there's any legislators that are working on any legislation that we should know about? Teresa, anything that you would like to add before we get started?
I think. Whoops! I just muted myself. I meant to unmute myself. No, Dan, I can't think of anything other than I think I will share with the group. As you know, Representative Noyes and I introduced a bill regarding home and community-based service rates, and we do a prioritization process in our committee where committee members get to indicate their preferences for bills that are of importance to them and their constituents and the state as a whole. And happy to report that after 4 years, that bill has made it to the top. So we hopefully will be taking some testimony on that during the course of time. But just wanted to let folks know that it did rise to the top in terms of priorities for our committee. And whether we do it through formal testimony on the bill or how we incorporate it into our budget document to the Committee on Appropriations, Representative Rosenquist and I are working on budget recommendations. We'll be meeting with Commissioner Hutt and her staff, and certainly have been getting feedback from the provider community and advocates around the needs of older Vermonters. And so we will be summarizing our budget recommendations to the Appropriations Committee that is due by next Friday. And I believe our committee's anticipating having ours done by hopefully next Thursday afternoon. So anybody who is listening in, if you our ability to meet, Representative Rosenquist and I have a limited ability to actually meet with people given time constraints, but we are more than happy to take any written feedback that you would like to provide to us. And seeing some familiar faces all around, but we have received a bunch of written feedback from people already. So appreciate that very much. And I think that's all I have, Dan.
Perfect. So might as well get started. Today we have Commissioner Hutt. This is her last week as commissioner, as I stated earlier. So I'm just going to turn the floor over to her, and she has a presentation that she will be giving us. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much. So I feel at some level like I may be preaching to the choir, and most of you have seen a version of this presentation multiple different times. The one thing that I will say is that part of the goal over the last few years at Dale is to kind of continue to highlight some of the issues that we know are facing older Vermonters. And so we keep updating the information around demographics and data so that we have a little bit of an ability to look at trend over time. So bear with me, because it will be things that you may have heard, but with updated information. The conversation that I had with Representative Noyes and Representative Wood to get ready for this was to imagine for a brief moment that COVID isn't the only thing that we're talking and thinking about. Recognizing that that's not going to change anytime soon, but that it is starting to change. And it was incredible to have Dr. Levine with us last week just to speak to kind of the progression as we move into vaccinations. But the bottom line is that we know that the issues that are most important to older Vermonters have been ongoing for many years and will continue into the future. So we wanted to take the opportunity early on in the session to refocus this caucus on some of those issues as well, so that you could kind of parallel think as you're continuing all the work that we're doing to consider and impact and address COVID, that we don't lose sight of some of the issues that we know have been at the forefront for older Vermonters. And I will say, and I will highlight it as I go through the presentation kind of quickly and candidly, that it is some of the reason for the shift in my position, because again, I've seen some statistics and some data points not change over a period of time, particularly, and we'll show you that when I get there, but when we're talking about substance use and misuse for older Vermonters and the impact that that has on falls and fall-related injuries and deaths, for me, it's part of this global focus. And so this new position will allow me to make sure that we're talking about older Vermonters when we're talking about the opiate crisis and substance use and misuse here in Vermont. So it's very connected, even though it might not totally seem that way for some of you, but for me, it really is. And I feel like I kind of just gave you my punchline. But anyway, I'm gonna I'm gonna jump in and try to share my screen and realize that as soon as I do that, I actually can't see my notes. So you are going to get me unfiltered, which is very exciting always. So
I like that, Monica. Unfiltered, very good.
All right, so are you seeing my screen?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. How about now?
There we go.
Great. All right. So I'm going to move through some of it kind of quickly because a lot of it are things that you know, but I always take the opportunity. Let me see if I can actually move myself forward here. Yes, I can. To just remind folks about the Department of Disabilities, Aging, and Independent Living. And here's where one of the catch-22s immediately jumps into play when we're thinking about older Vermonters. So we are the Department of Disabilities, Aging, and Independent Living. We do sit in the Agency of Human Services, and absolutely one of our goals is the idea of making Vermont the best state in which to grow old or live with a disability, really focused on dignity, respect, independence, choice, self-determination, person-centered. Those are absolutely the tenets of the work that we try to do as a department. And what often happens is that anything that people are talking about in relation to aging, folks tend to look at the department. And what we keep trying to say is not only do we have a robust network of community partners across the state of Vermont working on these issues, but the issues facing older Vermonters are issues of transportation, of rural development, of housing, of economic development. So as much as we feel tremendous ownership as a department over these issues, our goal is to make sure that we aren't the only department working on these. And so part of the push, and certainly part of the Older Vermonters Act that was passed last session, is to really recognize that these issues are facing all Vermonters, and that it's really about building this very robust community. So I always want to caveat the conversation about the department by saying, yes, it's our focus, but it should be everybody's focus. And that's really what our mission is. So quickly about the department, it's a pretty large department, and in the 5 divisions that we have, all touch older Vermonters, right? So the Adult Services Division is where our Choices for Care program sits, and our Older Vermonters Act services. And again, I'll talk about those a little bit more. But individuals in developmental services are also facing issues of aging because they grow old in our services, and their families and caregivers are growing older in our services, right? So again, it is ubiquitous across the department, this concept of aging. Voc Rehab and the Division for the Blind and Visually Impaired are focused not only on employment and employment for older Vermonters, but also the impacts of visual impairment as Vermonters age, and the independent living that we want to continue to support. DBVI in particular the Division for the Blind and Visually Impaired, really focuses on independent living. And vision loss and hearing loss, as we know, are both issues that will be part of our aging, part of our natural progression through our lifespan. And what we really want to do as a department is to continue to focus on independence and access to community. So that happens in those two departments, as well as employment. And then licensing and protection has both our adult protective services division, so investigating abuse, neglect, exploitation alleged of vulnerable Vermonters, to include older Vermonters. Not all older Vermonters are considered vulnerable Vermonters, but certainly they could be a subset of that group. And so just considering that. And then all of the licensing of our nursing homes, our residential care homes, our assisted living facilities. So all of that work, all of the work of aging, it really is permeating all 5 of the divisions of the department.
Commissioner?
Yes.
I'm just curious, do you want people to be able to, we didn't address this at the beginning, if they have questions, do you want people to hold them, or are you okay with people asking as you go along, or?
Oh, I'm definitely okay with people asking as I go along. I can't see everybody with my screen shared, so maybe you or Representative Noyes or Brian can tell me if there are questions that pop up. But yeah, this is a dialogue. I don't, you know, most of you know me well enough to know I won't stop talking unless somebody stops me. It's like a rolling stone, basically. But I'm happy to stop and talk. So let's do that.
Okay, so I'm going to use that opportunity to ask a question.
Sure.
So in the previous slide, you spoke to the, you know, more than $500 million going into the programs and services that the department provides, mostly through contracts with community providers. And I guess one of the things that I'm curious about, particularly given the stresses of the system that the pandemic has caused, that the governor's budget doesn't seem to address any cost of living increases or cost of, you know, doing business increases for any of the home and community-based provider system. I'm just wondering, you know, if you could, I don't expect you to address it per se, but if you could comment on that, because that is a real, it seemed to be a real sort of glaring thing out of the budget. And that includes, you know, AAAs, designated agencies, you know, the home health agencies, adult day providers. There's just a whole host of community-based providers that the state relies on, and that we as a system rely on. And it seems as though that the pandemic has shown how fragile those systems are, and yet I feel like we're not addressing those needs.
Yeah, it's sort of an enormous question. And I know you mentioned already, Representative Wood, that you and I are meeting with our budget team on Friday to go through this a little bit more. I think it's really important for folks to recognize a couple of different things. One is that, it is absolutely true that the services that we provide to older Vermonters and Vermonters with disabilities is in partnership with community providers. That's absolutely accurate. And we value those partnerships tremendously and have worked to support those providers, particularly through the pandemic, you know, as quickly and as robustly as we could. There always is in our budget a couple of different things. One is the caseload pressure that we see in both developmental services and in our Choices for Care program. That is almost always, at least, and I've been now through six budget cycles as the commissioner. That's always been our primary budget pressure, this idea that new people are coming into the system and we need to be able to support those new needs and also be able to support intensification of needs of those individuals that are already in the system. So our caseload asks are always really significant, running into the millions of dollars in our budget. And over the last many years in Vermont, you know, we have been charged with level funding our budget. And so when we have a pressure, when we have an additional cost, we have to find that, that funding within our existing budget. So there's always been this balance. Over the last few years, there certainly have been increases that have been, 2% over the last couple of years in Choices for Care, not in 21, but in the 3 years prior to that, and 2% increases in developmental services as well over the last few years. which I think the legislature has initiated, which has been wonderful. So we're sort of grateful, incredibly grateful for that partnership with the legislature to be able to put those dollars in. I do think it's an ongoing need in terms of our community-based system and continuing to keep it as robust as we can. And there's always this need to balance the budget. So it's complicated. You know, I know that you didn't expect much more from me than that, Representative Wood, in terms of explaining the dynamic, because I know that it's something that you're really familiar with.
Yes, no, I appreciate it. I just, you know, for the folks who are on the call and the people who may watch this, I think it's just important to recognize the stresses of those providers and in supporting older Vermonters and people with disabilities as part of the system. So I see. I'm gonna call first on the representative folks first. So Ruby, I'll call on you second. Representative Troiano, and then Ruby Baker.
Thank you, Teresa. So I have been invited to the last two annual meetings for the Craftsbury Community Care Center. And we've reviewed their budget and heard that their Medicaid reimbursement only covers a fraction of what the cost is to keep a resident there. They recently had a COVID outbreak that they have recovered quite well with. I think they may have lost one very elderly resident, but so this has been going on for years, Commissioner, and you know, it just breaks my heart to go out there and hear how they can't get nurses and they can't pay them enough to retain them, and all these difficulties for just a really genuinely beautiful community facility that we have close by. And it's really heartbreaking to see that they struggle so badly financially in trying to care for our older Vermonters.
And absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more, Representative Troiano. There have been, you know, so I always feel, so I apologize. I do not at all mean to sound defensive. I always feel like I have to offer a response, and I'm not trying to be at all dismissive. But
Okay.
when I talk, you know me well enough. So when I think about the residential care homes, there's a couple of things that come into play, right? One is that when we build, their rates are built on two different portions of the budget. And this is something to explore further down the line, right? But ACCS is the foundation, and that's actually a state Medicaid plan funding source. So that's the pure funding source that starts when anybody's in a residential care facility. It's a little bit different than in other kinds of facilities, but in residential care, which is what Craftsbury Commons is, it starts with ACCS. And that's a Medicaid state plan. So that actually sits in the DIVA budget, and I don't think it was last year, but I think it was the year before, we were able to increase the ACCS rate a little bit, which was really helpful. And then on top of that, not for everybody, but for those individuals who are eligible for Choices for Care, there is this ERC rate, enhanced residential care rate, on top of the ACCS rate. And that rate has seen, as I said, a couple of increases, I think over the last 3 years, of 2% in the Choices for Care budget, which did filter into that ERC rate. Is that sufficient for the kind of care that we want to see? That's a very different conversation, absolutely different. But know that it is something that we are really aware of, and we have tried, as the legislature has tried, and as the governor has, agreed to those budgets going forward. We've tried to move that. It's a big needle to move all at one time, but I would agree that we need to kind of keep whittling away at it for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you, Commissioner. And thank you. I would also add, if as legislators, we have an opportunity to influence what happens in the Appropriations Committee. So as people are concerned about that, let your appropriations buddies know about things that are, we're talking about here. And Ruby, we'll go to you, and then we'll let the commissioner continue on past her second slide.
Yeah, thanks, Teresa. And I've brought this up to Monica in the past, but I just want to highlight that when I think we've seen really specifically in the last year with the adult days, but this is true of many other service providers, that when our system is based on a fee-for-service model or a beds-filled model, what we end up doing is giving more stability to entities who can serve more people, which for those of us who live in rural areas and know how wonderful Craftsbury Commons is, or some of the other very small providers in the most remote areas, we know that as you have fewer people, your costs per person increase. It's that economies of scale. And so how can we build in a structure or reevaluate our payment system such that fee for service isn't the only way that our providers are supported? We need to recognize that they all have a base level that allows them to exist. And then we can start talking about, okay, we want more people coming in. There's reward, there's incentive to have all of your beds filled and to have all of that, especially during COVID, when places have intentionally reduced the number of people they serve to keep the people they are serving safe. How are we recognizing the disparities there?
Again, it's a great question, Ruby. I would toss to both Representative Wood and Representative Noyes. I think a funding conversation, not so much a budget conversation, but a funding structure conversation could be a really valuable one. And there are other players across the agency that really need to be a part of that. The Department for Vermont Health Access has had a really aggressive stance in terms of moving through both rate methodologies and rate structures that are formalized, in addition to supporting all of the departments to work on payment reform efforts. And so part of our, we are in queue working with DEVA right now in the developmental services realm around a payment reform effort, and in queue for a Choices for Care payment reform effort, starting with our adult day programs and then looking at some other rate methodology pieces. So it is a huge conversation that I think is critical as we really look to stabilize all of our service delivery, but particularly for older Vermonters, where we know the demographics are changing. And I want to get to those demographics to make sure that we can talk about that a little bit. But I do think it's really, when you hear people talking about value-based payments and rate methodologies and payment reform, it's easy to think about those as terms, and they kind of have this negative almost connotation because they're tied up in lots of sort of political dynamics. It's important to really get to the root of what those terms actually mean and how they can move us from a pure fee-for-service system, which is really the intent, to look at quality care and quality delivery of care and increased access to care. Care being this big word that encompasses all of our community base, because that's how Vermont does it. Right. So I would say really it's something to dig into further.
And it is one of those things that would be required in the Older Vermonters Act in looking at structures. And of course, we also have a bill on our wall that we talked about just before you came on, Commissioner Hutt. So let's let you get through some of your more slides before we continue.
No, that's okay. I love the dialogue. I absolutely welcome that. So I'm going to just, I'm going to buzz through a couple. We talked about the Adult Services Division, which is the Older Vermonters Act and Choices for Care. I'm not going to deeply walk into this with you, but I'll make this, I did send this to Representative Noyes, and if you would like to post it so people can take some more time with it, I'm happy to have you do that. But when we looked at the over, close to 70,000 Vermonters being served through DALE, we talk really about the Older Americans Act. So Choices for Care is the program that we tend to talk about people in residential care, people getting services through adult day programs, those more intensive services for individuals who present with more complex and clinical needs. But the Older Vermonters Act is really our whole population approach to aging in Vermont. And this is the place where we partner most closely with our area agencies on aging. Our senior centers are engaged, our meal sites are engaged. There's tremendous work that happens around wellness and aging and what those two concepts can mean together, which is so critical to then reduce the costs and care needs as somebody continues to age. So the Older Vermonters Act is really what I like to think about as our whole population approach to health, wellness, and aging in the state of Vermont. And it has a pretty extensive reach through our communities and is really a focus of what the department is doing. I know that you already had, I believe Angela's already presented to this caucus and talked a little bit about the state plan on aging, so I don't want to go into that. We've got a current state plan on aging. We've got a state plan on aging that's being developed right now. Our area agencies on aging are submitting their local regional plans. I believe that those are due at the beginning of the next month. And what I will say is that part of the work that we've done as a department, part of the work that you've been really successful as a legislative body is this engagement across Vermont with older Vermonters. So we did a statewide assessment 4 years ago, and we got about 12, maybe 1,200 responses total, maybe even a little bit less when we put out our survey to try to collect information from older Vermonters themselves. This year, we received over 3,000 responses to that survey. So more and more, we're getting a really representative swath of Vermonters, older Vermonters across the state and their caregivers to tell us what they need, what they want, what's working, what's not. And our state plan on aging is built on that. And the Older Vermonters Act, as Representative Wood has referenced a couple of times, is built on top of our state plan on aging in order to create a real continuum of planning and strategic thinking about aging here in Vermont and what that will mean for older Vermonters. And we talked a little bit about the Choices for Care program. So what I really want to get to is quickly looking at our partners. And this slide is by no means comprehensive. It doesn't include some of our advocacy organizations like Cove, Ruby's here today, but these are our service providers. So those individuals that are actually responsible, or not individuals, those organizations that are responsible for service delivery across the state of Vermont. So just important to note that that's how Vermonters are accessing services. Statewide services are through this network of community providers. And then there are those organizations like Cove that continue to represent and advocate.
Looks like Ruby had a question in the chat. Ruby?
Oh, I definitely cannot see the chat. So
yeah,
okay.
I'm trying to keep an eye on it and also looking for hands raised. So
no, Monica should keep going. I was posing the question broadly to the group.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, definitely interrupt me because
yeah, and I can actually send that. I can attach that survey that was done out on the next email I send out to the group.
Oh, that would be great. So here's really where I wanted to get us though, because again, remember I sort of started this by saying we need to remember that once COVID is over, we still have lots of work that we want to be doing. And so it starts with just a really unvarnished view of the demographics here in Vermont. And you all have seen me and heard me say this a million times. The fact that we have an aging demographic is simply that. It is a fact. It is not a negative. It is not a positive. It just simply is. And trying to really recognize that and plan for that as a state is critical, I think, to the business of this state in terms of those individuals as economic participants, and those individuals as voters. We just need to recognize that this is an increasing population in Vermont, and what does that actually mean? So we talk about the fact that Vermont is in line to be the oldest state in the nation in terms of our population, and that's not new information. And then we're trying to pull out some other newer demographics that we're paying attention to in terms of the number of Vermonters over the age of 60 who are living, below the poverty level. So what's their economic picture? What's their disability picture in terms of health and well-being? What about their participation in our labor force? You know, Vermont talks a lot. We talk a lot about the workforce issues that we have here as a state. We know that the governor has a priority in terms of sort of meeting that workforce need for our Vermont businesses. We know that there's a push to bring new, families into the state. And the governor has been really committed to utilizing the workforce that we already have, both on the disability side and on the older Vermonter side. So kind of recognizing that we've got a very vibrant group of older Vermonters, some of whom work because they want to, some of whom work because they have to, but all of whom, or most of whom, work. So just continuing to look at some of the other demographics that we have, Vermont's rate of volunteerism across the rest of the country is incredibly high, which is something that we're very proud of. We also know that we've got some issues in terms of some of those chronic diseases that are really impacting older Vermonters, Alzheimer's really being one of them. We have an extraordinarily high rate of Alzheimer's diagnosis here in the state of Vermont. There's not a lot of data or information about why that rate is so high, but we know that it is in fact true. So that's something that we pay attention to a lot. And then just really considering the population of family caregivers, which is another topic I would really encourage this caucus to take on, because we've got a multitude, I was going to say horde, and that's the wrong visual, but we've got a lot of family caregivers who are unpaid, who are really the backbone for the care and supports that our older Vermonters need. If all of those caregivers needed to be paid, it would break the bank. There'd be no way for us to sustain that as a state. So it's critical that and they don't necessarily want to be paid, but it's critical that we continue to plan to support them. Because it is such a critical component of care for those older Vermonters that do need that. So a couple of just areas, we do pay a lot of attention to our internal data, and we also try to pay attention to a couple of different national rankings that just give us a sense of where we live in the universe. It's just pure information. So there are two that I just want to highlight for you. In the America's Health Rankings report, overall senior health in Vermont in 2020 was ranked as seventh, so up from 8th in 2019. So that's a good trajectory, right? We're seeing some improvement there. It tends to be pretty high, and it has tended to stay high, but we certainly like to see it continuing to increase. And that report highlights kind of areas of strength for us as a state, and areas of challenge. So we've seen great progress in terms of this food insecurity. When I first started 5 or 6 years ago at this point in time, there was a different level of food insecurity for older Vermonters, and there was a real focus across multiple departments in state government, not just Dale, to really ensure that not only home delivered meals and congregate meals were accessible, but that we were getting good uptake in our 3 Squares Vermont program for older Vermonters. And so this report really points out that our prevalence of food insecurity for older Vermonters has gone down. It's low, which is tremendously important when you think about food. And if you're Italian at all, food is the cornerstone of life, right? It's the basis for nutrition and love and faith. It's everything. So this was one that really kind of tugged at my heartstrings, to be honest. A high prevalence of high health status, which is people just identifying for themselves as individuals how they felt about their health and if they felt like they were healthy and well. And then a low prevalence of some of those chronic conditions. But our challenges have been pretty consistent over time. This idea of a high prevalence of falls, and then concurrently fall-related injuries and death. And I'll give you some more data on that in just a few moments. Low percentage of hospice care use, kind of using those services so that people can die where they want with family around them, or receiving the kind of care that they need to die well, which is, after all, a part of life. And a low prevalence of cancer screenings. That was a new one that popped up on this particular report this last year. That's not something we had ever seen before, and that was somewhat surprising to us. Kind of moving through quickly, let me know if there are questions. And looking a little bit more at the senior health report. So we saw this decrease in food insecurity, We saw actually a slight increase in residents that were low care in nursing homes, which means folks are making a choice or needing to be or ending up in nursing homes, even though their care needs are not particularly high, which is not a trend that we want to necessarily see continue. Looking at home healthcare workers, we talked about the cancer screenings, a decrease in flu vaccination coverage, which I found to be sort of fascinating, and I'm not entirely sure why, but also a decrease in early deaths. So I'm just pulling out some interesting facts from that report. It is linked in this PowerPoint, so when you get it, you can go and scroll through yourself just to check it out. It's sort of great information, and it does give you state-by-state comparisons, which are interesting. So the other scorecard that we tend to use and look at is the long-term services and support state scorecard, and where the overall health rankings really spoke more to that whole population health, like I talk about when I talk about our older Vermonters and the Older Vermonters Act or the Older Americans Act. The long-term services and supports is a little bit more specific to our Choices for Care program. So individuals with more complex needs who might actually need nursing home level of care and might be getting that care in their own communities, or might be getting that care in a nursing home or in a residential care facility. So this is Vermont in 2020 was ranked as 5th, which is a little bit of a decrease from 3rd 3 years ago in 2017. Now, I will also say in our defense as a state, the scorecard, the measures that they use change every time. So I'm not really sure how the rankings are entirely helpful, except kind of in the moment. They aren't really trendable across time because they change what they use as standards for rankings every time that they reissue the scorecard. But it does give you kind of a point in time sense of where you're at. And again, this report also does the state-by-state comparison. So it just gives you some things to think about. Again, highlighting some of Vermont's strengths and some of our particular areas of challenge. Not a huge surprise that affordability and access remains something that we struggle with as a state. Here's really where I wanted to focus this though. And again, folks have heard me talk about these areas for 5 or 6 years at this point in time. And the fact that I am still talking about these areas over those 5 years tells me that they are remaining, are kind of critical issues in Vermont for older Vermonters. So falls and fall related deaths amongst Vermont, this is an area where we tend to rank high across the country. We're 48th in the nation for this. And there are lots of reasons that contribute. So the rural nature of our state, the long winters, the light kind of fading early at so many points in the year, but also connected to substance use and misuse, mismanagement of medications, hearing loss, which can contribute to falls. There are a lot of factors that come into play when you're talking about fall-related injuries and deaths. So it's one of those proxy measures that tells you where you need to focus in other arenas when you're talking about health and well-being for older Vermonters. Our death by suicide rate in Vermont also tends to be high amongst older Vermonters. We're ranked 29th in the nation for that. And that has been consistent over the last 5 years. Again, it's contributed to by some level of isolation, by the rural nature of the state, by the light and the dark and how that impacts people. But this is something that we are paying attention to and should be paying even more attention to, and are happy to be partnering right now with the Department of Mental Health as they expand their suicide prevention efforts and have been able to help us to fund a little bit more extensively our elder care clinicians across the state of Vermont, working specifically with mental health and older Vermonters who might actually be homebound, but needing connection to a mental health counselor. So this is something, when I look at suicide, and I'm sure that this is true across the board in DMH, it's one of those things that you look at and say, we should be able to make a difference here. Like, we cannot continue to lose Vermonters to death by suicide. And so what do we need to do actively and aggressively to prevent that, to guard against it? Substance use, and this was, where I kind of buried the lead at the beginning of my of my presentation. We know that substance use and misuse among older Vermonters is a huge issue. You know, it's compounded by the fact that people are not necessarily taking into account that their physiology changes as they age. And so practices that they were able to tolerate as a 22-year-old, as a 42-year-old, as a 52-year-old might not be able to be continued as their body continues to change. And so education is really critical and important here. But again, it tends to be an area that's high in the state of Vermont. And most areas are beginning to recognize more and more, and we've talked about this before, the impact of social isolation on people. And it seems so, it was such a foreshadowing that we started to measure this before the pandemic hit and recognize now that it's just become more of a significant issue. But we know that there's a physical response to isolation, a physical health response, both on mental health and physical health, that we have to take into account. And Vermont tends to rank high for the risk factors that could create social isolation. So you can't necessarily measure isolation or social isolation in Vermonters, but you can utilize the risk factors that lead to isolation. And again, Vermont tends to rank higher in some of those risk factors, which include poverty, living alone, divorce, never married, disability, independent living difficulties. So some of the factors that are a little higher here in Vermont contribute to an awareness that this is an issue that we need to take on. So we've talked a lot about this idea of reframing aging, and I always struggle in any presentation like this because I'm telling you all the negative things, and yet part of our work is around reframing and taking charge of the narrative in a different way and talking about wellness when it comes to aging, talking about the positives of aging, because it is a self-fulfilling prophecy, you know, in terms of the negative. If it's always focused on as a negative, if we talk about us as an aging state and that has a negative connotation, it can be really defeating. So this idea of taking charge of how we talk about it, recognizing that we do need to talk about people's vulnerabilities and needs, but we don't need to focus only on vulnerability and need, that we need to talk about the population as a contributing population, as an engaged population, as an employed population, as the backbone of our libraries, our school boards, our civic engagement, our legislature, right? I mean, this is how Vermont gets stuff done. That's what older Vermonters are doing every day. And having that conversation is as critical as talking about all of the needs that surround that. So trying to balance that has been our effort collectively in the department and across our partner agencies for the last 5 years, and I imagine will continue into the future. So just going to scroll through a couple of slides because I talk a little bit about why it matters so much, but I think, again, this is a group that understands that. And then finally, I think that this is my last slide, but just sort of looking ahead and framing where you as a legislature are going, where our partners are going. We had the Older Vermonters Act that passed last year. We are beginning, in fact, I've got to scoot off for a 1 o'clock meeting with stakeholders around the Action Plan for Aging Well, which is the next frontier for us as a state of Vermont. And it's really bringing together this idea of wellness and productivity and contribution with, you know, that balance on needs and services and supports. And that's where I think Vermont is doing a great job, is that we're sort of acknowledging both ends of that spectrum and understanding that we need to address them both in order to be really successful as we move forward. So I think that's my last. I'm going to stop sharing the screen and sort of open it up for conversation.
Great, thank you. Really appreciate this. So we'll take some questions, but I want to ask the first one because, as I said, this is Commissioner Hutt's last week, and I just wondered what do you feel your biggest accomplishment has been as being commissioner?
So I will say that Representative Noyes gave me a heads up that he was going to ask that question, and thank God, because I like froze when he first started to talk about it. And I will say, just this is what I would say. There's maybe one thing that I take credit for, and everything else has been, you know, like this joint effort, because no one person together we matter a lot. No one person really matters all that much when you're really looking at it, right? So the one thing that I take full credit for is having pulled the State Unit on Aging back together in the department. When I got there, the large 3-person team that comprises our State Unit on Aging was scattered across all 5 divisions. I'm not entirely sure why, but they had been kind of separated. So nutrition wasn't sitting with the person that was focusing on the state plan on aging, and they weren't talking to the person that was doing the data and analysis. And that didn't make any sense to me, you know, so I literally physically put them back together as a unit. And that's the only thing that I take credit for. Everything else has been really a joint effort. I think that the Older Vermonters Act was a labor of love across everybody on this call. You know, all of our partners, the legislature, the department, the governor's office, you know, we did that together and crafted it into something that made sense for us. The reframing aging work that we've done, the fact that everybody talks about older Vermonters instead of senior citizens, it's a tiny little switch, but it's a switch that happened over the last few years that we collectively agreed to because we wanted the focus to be different. And the power of that one little example, I think, has permeated the work that we have done together over the last few years, where we really are balancing the idea of employment with the idea of services and supports in a nursing home. Like neither of them takes precedent. They are equally important, and that's how we talk about it. There has been tremendous work, I think, on the partnerships that we as a department have with our partners, with our community providers. Some of those relationships, you know, any relationship needs care and feeding. And I think that as a department, we've worked really hard to care and feed those relationships. It's not always perfect. I make people mad on a daily basis. I don't imagine that that will stop. But I think that we have these respectful relationships that have allowed us to bring our grievances to the table, to air them, to figure out how to move forward, to figure out when to agree to disagree. And that's huge in terms of moving Vermont forward. And then the one thing that I've not ever really had the opportunity to talk with you all about, and I hope that you will dig into more, but some of the work that Angela Smith-Jang and I have been engaged with in partnership with the health department, with the UVM Center on Aging, with One Care, I'm trying to think who else has been at the table. Oh, the UVM School of Nursing, is we are this close to launching work this summer that will push out education and training for primary care providers to be able to diagnose Alzheimer's more quickly. There is a huge gap in the state of Vermont right now. We have the Memory Center at UVM. There is a 6 to 8 month wait for an individual to go to the memory care center and be diagnosed. We know that primary care providers have the capacity to do this work, and 6 to 8 months in the life of a family and an individual with Alzheimer's is a lifetime. And if you can get that diagnosis more quickly, if you can be linked to services and supports, if you can make those life-altering decisions about the care that you want and the legal things that you need to get in place, you can make this disease, if not manageable, at least tolerable. And that's critical for families in Vermont. So we've got a curriculum that will be launching on the Vermont Health Learn Network for primary care providers. We have an ECHO project that will be starting here in Vermont in the summer for primary care teams, including their social workers, including their nurse practitioners. And we have Dr. William Pendlebury, who's going to be doing a corner, what does he call it? A clinical corner with Will or something like that, where he will be available for consultation to primary care teams across the state of Vermont, no matter who they're meeting with, no matter what their clinical questions are. He wants to be available to answer them, to really empower those primary care physicians to make diagnoses, to be clear, direct with families, and to link them then to the service system, to the Alzheimer's Association, and to those caregiver supports through our area agencies on aging more quickly. Because that is, I think, it's not tolerable that we allow that to malinger. And so that's something that I'm tremendously proud of, and we've been working on collectively over the last probably 2.5 years now.
Yeah,
so
and that's
thanks
also,
for asking, Dan.
No, that's very good information, and that's come up a number of times on the Vermont Commission on Alzheimer's. we talk about how we're going to work on early diagnosis. And so I really appreciate hearing that that's moving forward at that level. So thank you. How about any other questions out there? I'm going to try to watch, see if anyone puts their hand up, or you can just unmute. Do we have any questions for the commissioner here? Yeah, Chip, Representative Toriano.
Right, just more of a comment. Last week we had we reviewed a Dartmouth University College survey on housing is health, and it comes to my mind sitting here and discussing this that there are one of the issues that we didn't really see here today was that older Vermonters living in homes alone often have issues surrounding deferred maintenance, and their homes become even dangerous to be living in. So, we can try and do it through weatherization, but weatherization has limits in what they can do to a dwelling. They also have limitations as far as how fast they can get to a residence. And I had a very difficult time trying to get a roof for a older Vermonter in my district whose roof was really leaking badly. So it's something that we need to keep in mind that the worse conditions that you live in, the worse health you are in. And that's become a real issue, and it was very obvious. I could share this survey that we reviewed in committee the other day, but it's really an issue that doesn't often come up, but I think it is becoming critical as our housing stock ages as well as our population.
Absolutely. And that's one of those areas where I feel like, I love that you brought up weatherization because, we know that there is some really enhanced funding for that program over the next few years, which is great. Having worked in that program for a very brief period of time when I was at the Department for Children and Families, I know how much that program actually does support older Vermonters in some of those older homes. And there was a period of time where we had done some training and some work with the weatherization techs so that they could actually do a quick visual assessment of a home to look for fall risks. I think that program isn't necessarily happening at this moment in time, but it's one of those places where you're like, look, this is a great collaboration, and helps to bring that focus and that attention to a different part of the world altogether. But these techs are wonderful. They're trained to work with people. They're wonderful in terms of walking into people's homes. If they could do a quick visual scan and assessment and leave some referral information, we could get more services and supports in and deeper assessments around just some of the risks in people's homes and then we need to figure out how to fix them. But there are those organizations, the area agencies on aging do some of that work already in terms of assessment of home and physical safety. But wouldn't it be cool to link that to our techs so that there is a real understanding that, again, it's not just our issue in Dale, it's not just the area agencies on aging, right? This is this global part of the conversation that we just need to keep supporting, I think.
And we've, I don't know if anyone saw any of this news just came out, but the government with this new stimulus bill that just came out, they've doubled the size of AmeriCorps and put another $1 billion into AmeriCorps for this coming year. And so Senator Ram and I have been meeting with Phil Coling about how can we utilize some of this funding for housing, whether weatherization or repairs, through an AmeriCorps program, and really trying to look at, so I'm sure you'll be hearing about that coming up, but that's going to be pretty significant to take a program that has always been at $1 billion and to double the size of it. So I'm not sure what that will look like coming up, or if they can grow it that large in a quick amount of time, but we'll see. Looks like we have a question from Jim.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Monica, I'm sorry, I came in just as you were talking about ERC and Medicaid. I hate to have you go back and repeat something, but can you elaborate a little bit more on, because I think that is an area, the Medicaid, especially for long-term care residential, the costs. And then there was, I don't recall who was mentioning, I think it was Ruby, mentioning about the scale of a facility or a program. When they're smaller, the flexibility is difficult, especially with COVID and trying to double up on staff to help when you're bringing people in and all that. So tell me, what are the chances that we can see more money in that area? And yeah, I think that's the question.
So again, I think you probably came in, Jim, a little bit as we were already talking about that. I think what I heard Representative Wood saying was that there, at this point in time, the budget is out there for this year, the budget adjustment, and for FY22. And I think that right now is when the legislature is sort of taking testimony, trying to understand what they're going to do to impact it. So in the immediate, I think it's very much on the minds of the legislature and a part of the conversations that they're having. I think what I was talking about was just trying to articulate how rates are built in sort of smaller residential care. So ACCS Medicaid, and then on top of that might be ERC. So I was sort of offering that explanation. I feel like I'm not answering your question, but I'm not sure that I totally understand what it is. So.
Well, I guess, I mean, in part, I'm asking because I want to highlight my concern is that with COVID, we have in our group, Living Well group, we have a small facility that is, as we get empty beds, we then, in order to take someone new in, the cost is higher. Because you have to double up staff and all that. So I guess I'm trying to figure out what maybe it's just about the chances of Medicaid helping get some focus on that. And maybe I'm not asking well, but if it's level funded, that's not helpful. We can see, my concern is across the state, we've already seen a number of facilities that have closed, and I'm worried that more would, and that would be the smaller ones who just don't have that flexibility. So maybe it's as much about asking, is it firm that it won't go up, or can we really, what's the best place to urge that we recognize Medicaid is not paying for it and enough. So.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think I would just reiterate that at this moment in time, and I realize that it's a super unsatisfactory answer from me, but at this moment in time, I think the budget is really in the hands of the legislature to walk through their part of the process. It's that three-legged stool of government. So I guess that's where I would direct you at this moment in time.
I think that we will be having some discussion about that in our committee, and then hopefully people will reach out to the Appropriations Committee. So, all right. Well, thank you, everybody. I know that it's pretty much 1 o'clock here, so I want to be respectful of everybody's time, and we're all probably starting our next meeting at 1 o'clock. So I appreciate, Commissioner, all your work over the time that you've been the commissioner. We've greatly enjoyed working with you, and you've been coming to our caucus and supporting it has been it's been very appreciative. So thank you so much, and I'm sure we'll be talking in the years to come in your new role. So awesome.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much.
Yeah.
I'll be seeing you. I'm not even going to bother saying goodbye. So.
All right. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next week. Take care. Be well. Brian, do you want to stop the